Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Hey, before we get into today's message, I just have a quick request to make of every one of you. Some of you here are familiar with the Beck family, Doug and Stella and Selena Beck. They've been members of this church for quite a few years. They haven't been able to be here much at all in the last couple of years because there are just so many health problems in that family. Right now, the worst one is the daughter, Selena. Selena has had cerebral palsy for many years, and she's dying. It's really any day. She's under hospice care, and she is just an angel of God. Now, here's the way. The reason I'm putting this on your heart is April 16th is Selena's birthday. And it is going to be her last birthday on this earth, barring any kind of divine miracle of God. And so what I thought would be beautiful is if everybody in this church sent her a birthday card. Whether you know her or not, whether you've ever met her or not, just your name and South Louisville Christian Church and a birthday card that says God loves you would bring so much joy to this person. And so what I've done is I've put these little cards with her name and her address, and they're right back there on the Connect table. If every one of you today would leave with one of these and put a birthday card in the mail for Selena this week, you would bring a lot of joy to that family. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Pastor.
Thank you. Well, it's springtime outside, isn't it? Did you guys notice?
Yes.
Notice that? Isn't it great? I love springtime. I love spring for several reasons. First of all, I'm tired of winter. I'm ready for some warmer weather. I also love spring because everything comes into bloom, and that's beautiful. But the very best thing about spring is it's baseball season again. Amen? Can I get an amen? I love baseball. I love baseball my whole life. Now, one of the ways the game of baseball has changed in my lifetime is with the addition of something called the relief pitcher. See, it used to be the pitcher that started the game would pitch the whole game. He pitched the whole 9 innings. The same pitcher that started the game would finish the game. But that almost never happens anymore. Nowadays what happens is the starting pitcher will go like 6 or 7 innings, and then they'll bring in a relief pitcher, and the relief pitcher will finish up the job for them. Wouldn't it be nice if life worked that way? Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't you love it if you were at work and you were having a tough day, you got a little tired, you could just go on home, bring in a reliever to finish up for you? Man, wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if you were having an argument with your spouse and you were losing, you could bring in a reliever to finish up for you? It'd be really nice if life worked that way, but it doesn't, does it? In life, we don't have the option of bringing in a reliever when things get tough. In life, we have to stay in the game when things get tough. When you get to the end of the month and you don't have enough money to pay your bills, you still have to stay in the game, don't you? When you got a job that you can't stand and you don't know how you're going to make it through one more day, you still have to stay in the game, don't you? If you've got health problems, if you're hurting and you don't know when you're going to feel better, you still have to stay in the game. Well, I'm going to introduce you today to one of the great prophets of the Old Testament, a man named Jeremiah. And if there was ever a man who could have used a relief pitcher to come in and finish up for him, it would have to be Jeremiah. You see, Jeremiah lived at a time when Israel had turned away from God. And Jeremiah spent his whole life just trying to get people to turn back to God. Only people never listened to him. He spent 40 years just trying to get people to turn back to God, but they didn't listen. Instead of listening to him, they mocked him. And they persecuted him. And they even plotted to kill him. If there was ever somebody who could have used a reliever to come in and finish up for him, it would have been Jeremiah. But that just wasn't an option for him. Jeremiah had to stay in the game just like we do. Now, Jeremiah lived at a time when the kingdom of Israel had been divided in two. So now there was the northern kingdom of Israel, and there was the southern kingdom of Judah. Well, the northern kingdom of Israel had already been invaded by the Assyrians. And the Assyrians had conquered the northern kingdom. The northern tribes were all but gone. And that left the southern kingdom of Judah very vulnerable. What made them even more vulnerable is that they have turned away from God.
Mercy.
My friends, this one thing was true then, and it is still true today. When you turn away from God, you will be vulnerable.
Amen.
When you turn away from God, you will be weakened. That's what's going on in Judah at this point. And then this other nation comes. This nation called Babylon. And Babylon is led by a king named Nebuchadnezzar. And the armies of Babylon sweep through the southern kingdom of Judah, and they come all the way to the great city of Jerusalem, and they surround the city with all the people inside. This is from Jeremiah chapter 32. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the 10th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, which was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. The army of the king of Babylon was then besieging Jerusalem, and Jeremiah the prophet was confined in the courtyard of the guard in the royal palace of Judah. Now Zedekiah, king of Judah, had imprisoned him there, saying, "Why do you prophesy as you do? You say, 'This is what the Lord says. I'm about to hand this city over to the king of Babylon, and he will capture it. Zedekiah, king of Judah, will not escape out of the hands of the Babylonians, but will certainly be handed over to the king of Babylon, and will speak with him face to face, and see him with his own eyes. He will take Zedekiah to Babylon, where he will remain until I deal with him, declares the Lord. If you fight against the Babylonians, you will not succeed." Jeremiah said, "The word of the Lord came to me. Hanamel, son of Shallum, your uncle is going to come to you and say, 'Buy my field at Anathoth, because as your nearest relative, it is your right and duty to buy it.'" Then, just as the Lord had said, my cousin Hanamel came to me in the courtyard of the guard and said, "Buy my field at Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. Since it is your right to redeem it and possess it, buy it for yourself." I knew that this was the word of the Lord, so I bought the field at Anathoth from my cousin Hanamel and weighed out for him 17 shekels of silver. A lot of confused looks on your faces right now. I know this sounds a little strange, I know, but if you'll allow me to, I'm going to do my best to explain it to you.
Preach, Theo.
So the Babylonian army has the city of Jerusalem surrounded. And the king in Jerusalem is a man named Zedekiah. Now Zedekiah is looking out at that army of Babylon surrounding his city, and he is nervous. He is worried. He is scared. But all the advisors that are close to the king, they keep telling him there's nothing to worry about. They keep telling the king, "Hey, we're going to win this fight. Don't worry. We're the people of God. We are God's chosen. God's on our side. We're going to win." But while everybody else is telling the king, "We're going to win," Jeremiah the prophet tells him, "No, we won't." Jeremiah tells him, "We are not going to win this fight. God has warned us over and over again to turn back to Him. And we didn't listen." And now we're going to have to pay a price for that. Jeremiah tells the king the best thing they can do, the only hope they have, is just to surrender to the Babylonians. How do you think that message went over? Not very good, right? His message didn't go over very well. Listen, there is one thing that's true of all the great prophets of the Old Testament. They are almost never loved for their message. Those prophets in the Old Testament, they spoke the hard truth of God. And people often don't want to hear the hard truth of God. Because the hard truth is hard. But Jeremiah is faithful to his God. He speaks the hard truth that God asks him to speak. But Zedekiah, the king, he doesn't want to hear that truth. And so rather than listening to Jeremiah, the king has Jeremiah beaten. And then the king has him thrown down into a well. And then the king has him thrown into prison. So this is a terrible ordeal for Jeremiah. Jeremiah is going through a terrible ordeal. If there was ever somebody who needed a relief prophet to come in and finish up the job, it had to be Jeremiah. But that just wasn't an option. You know, you and I are probably never going to have to suffer like Jeremiah did. But I think you can probably relate to Jeremiah's suffering. You're probably never going to be surrounded by the Babylonian army. But I'll bet you know what it feels like to be surrounded by enemies. Huh? Probably a king is never going to have you beaten up. But I'll bet you know what it's like to feel beat down. Probably nobody's ever going to throw you down into a well, but I bet you've had to claw your way out of a few holes. And I pray to God that you never get thrown in prison, but I'll bet you know the feeling of being a prisoner. Now, I think you can probably all relate to Jeremiah's suffering here. This is a terrible ordeal he's going through. It is a painful, terrible ordeal. But right in the middle of that terrible ordeal, God tells Jeremiah to do the strangest thing. God tells Jeremiah to go buy this piece of land. God says, since it is your right to redeem it and possess it, go and buy it for yourself. This is such a strange command from God. Because think about the circumstances here. The king wants Jeremiah dead. The Babylonian army has surrounded the city of Jerusalem. God has already told Jeremiah that Jerusalem is going to fall. Jerusalem's going to be burned to the ground. All the people are going to be taken away in captivity. I mean, this doesn't seem like the right time to go buy some land. The city's going to be destroyed. All the people are going to be taken away in captivity. That's not good for property values. This just doesn't seem like the best time to go invest in real estate. But that's exactly what God tells Jeremiah to do. And as strange as that command is, it is from the mind of God. So you know it's going to be brilliant, right? And it is. It's brilliant. And I'll tell you why. Because what God just did was, He just gave Jeremiah a way to stay in the game in these difficult days ahead. God just gave Jeremiah a lesson in perseverance. And the lesson is this. When you are going through trials, you need to claim your promised future. Amen. When the day you're living in is difficult, you need to focus on God's promises for tomorrow. When you are going through trial, claim your promised future. Jeremiah knows that Jerusalem is going to fall. He knows that Jerusalem is going to be burned to the ground. He knows that all the Israelites are going to be taken away in captivity. He knows that because God has already shown him that. But God has also shown him that one day the Israelites are going to come back home. And when they do, they're going to rebuild their city and they're going to rebuild their nation. And so when God tells Jeremiah to go buy that piece of property, he's telling Jeremiah to invest in that promised future. This is not just about Jeremiah buying a piece of land. It's about him investing in this promise from God. So that's what Jeremiah does. He goes and he buys that land. I knew that this was the word of the Lord, so I bought the field in Anathoth from my cousin Hanamel and weighed out for him 17 shekels of silver. Jeremiah buys that land because what he's doing is he is investing in God's promised future. Jeremiah is in the middle of the most difficult days of his life. And he knows that there are more difficult days ahead. But he is trusting God's promise that better days are coming. And so he's not just investing in a piece of land. He's investing in this promise from God. I think maybe you can understand this. Sometimes what keeps us stuck in a trial is when we can't see the way out. Have you ever had this happen to you where things get really tough and your story is not going the way you hoped it would and you don't see any way for the story to change and then you start to lose faith in the end of the story?
Preach, Theo.
Have you ever had that happen to you? Have you ever started to lose faith in the end of the story? Years ago when I was in the United States Army, we got introduced to this guy named Admiral James Bond Stockdale. James Bond Stockdale. Yeah, his first two names were James Bond, but this guy kind of deserved it. I mean, he kind of earned it. This guy was a warrior. He was a fighter pilot during World War II. During the Vietnam War. And he flew like 50 combat missions during the Vietnam War. And then one day his plane got shot down. And he parachuted out of this burning plane, but he was captured by the Viet Cong and taken to a prisoner of war camp. Well, he spent 8 years in that POW camp. 8 years of being tortured and beaten almost every day. And he survived. But he didn't just survive. He led this prisoner resistance group. He helped hundreds of his fellow prisoners survive that torture. And he survived that camp for 8 long years. When he finally got back to America, they asked him how he survived. This is what he said. He said, "I never lost faith in the end of the story." You see, that's what God is telling Jeremiah here. Don't lose faith in the end of the story. That's why God told Jeremiah to go buy that piece of land, even when everything around him looks so hopeless. Because God is telling Jeremiah, you are living in this part of the story. But this part of the story is not the end of the story. Have faith in the end of the story. Claim your promised future. Don't lose faith in the end of the story. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, it says, "We are pressed on every side by troubles, but not crushed and broken. We are perplexed because we don't know why things happen as they do, but we don't give up and quit. We are hunted down, but God never abandons us. We get knocked down, but we get up again, and we keep going." In other words, my friends, we don't lose faith in the end of the story. We are troubled. Yes, we are. but we are not broken. We are perplexed, but we do not give up. We get knocked down, but we get back up again because we don't lose faith in the end of this. We know the end of the story, amen? And we don't lose faith in that. I love what God told Jeremiah right in the middle of a terrible trial. God says to Jeremiah, I know the plans I have for you. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope in the future. God spoke those words to Jeremiah. But you need to know that those words are not just for Jeremiah. Those words belong to you. God spoke those words to you. God is telling you, I have a plan for you. I have a plan for you right now, so don't lose faith in the end of the story, because I wrote the end of the story. God says, I wrote the end. I know the plans I have for you. They are plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. And God says you can have faith in that. Have faith in the end of the story. You know, I doubt that I'm ever going to be surrounded by a Babylonian army. I doubt that a king is ever going to throw me down in a well or throw me in prison for preaching God's word. I don't think my circumstances will ever be quite like Jeremiah's were. But here's what will happen. I will suffer. And I will go through trials. I will. And when I do, I'm going to remember what God told Jeremiah. You go buy that piece of land. You go claim your promised future. Have faith in the end of the story. I know the plans I have for you. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Listen, I'm going to go through trials in this life. And when I do, I'm going to claim that promise right there. God makes that promise to me, and that promise is precious to me. And God makes that promise to you, and God doesn't make empty promises. When God speaks those words to you, He means those words to you. I know the plans I have for you. I can build my life on those words right there. And those words are especially important to me when I'm going through times of trial. Is there anybody here today going through trial? Not to embarrass you, not to call you out, but if there's anybody here today going through a trial, would you just raise your hand right now? Wow, look at that. That's a lot of hands. God gave me this message just for you today. Amen. Amen. But listen, even if you didn't raise your hand, even if things are going along pretty comfortably for you right now, you understand, don't you? A trial's coming. It is coming. The rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. We all have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. You may be comfortable now, but a trial is coming. And when it does, you're going to want to remember that promise right there. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. They are plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. With the time I have left today, I want to show you a few powerful things about that promise right there. And the first thing I want to show you about that promise is really simple. It probably seems really obvious to you, but I want you to really think about this for a moment. God has a plan for you. Amen. For you. God says, I know the plans I have for you. see, this is a deeply personal promise from God to you. God is looking you right in the eye, and He says, I've got a plan for you, Teresa. I've got a plan for you, Patty. I've got a plan for you, Gigi. I've got a plan for you, Bob. I've got a plan for you, Greg. He says, I have a plan just for you. Now, my plan for you is not the same as my plan for her, and it's not the same as my plan for him. So don't compare your circumstances to anybody else's, because I got a different plan for them, but I also have a plan just for you.
Amen.
Isn't it beautiful?
Beautiful.
Would you say these words with me? God has a plan for me. Say it again. God has a plan for me. Say it one more time. Feel it. God has a plan for me. Amen. Now listen. If it's God's plan for you, what do you think the chances are that it's the best plan for your life?
Absolutely.
You think maybe it's better than your plan? When you're in the middle of your darkest hour, when you're surrounded by enemies, when you feel like you're in prison, you just remember God has a plan for you.
Amen.
You know, it's real easy when you're suffering to start thinking God has forgotten you or that God has forsaken you. It's so easy when you're suffering to think, God, why did you do this to me? But don't miss this point. God has a plan for you. There is a purpose behind everything that happens to you. God has a plan. No matter what you have to go through in this life, God has a plan for you, and His plan is for your best. God is on your side. God has a plan for you, and God is on your side.
Good for you.
Amen? Now I want to go a little deeper now. I want to take you by the hand and lead you into some deeper water. God has a plan for you. That means that God looks you right in the eye and says, I know my plan for you, and I'm always thinking of you. You see, if God has a plan for you, that means that God is always thinking of you.
Yeah.
Now, here's what's so important for you to understand. As God thinks about you, His thoughts are always at peace. You see, I know that some of you here today, you are anxious about your circumstances. God is not anxious about your circumstances.
Amen.
Some of you here today, you're worried about your life. God's not worried about your life. Because God knows there is nothing to worry about. You see, we worry because our little minds, we can't see what God's doing. We don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know the end of the story. But God does see what's going to happen next. God does know the end of the story, and God's not worried. Amen?
Yeah.
So when you're in that trial and you can't see a way out, you just remember that God is thinking about you, and His thoughts are always at peace. Amen? Finally, God has a plan for you. And praise God for this. His plans are always for your good. He says, my plan is to prosper you, not to harm. My plan is to give you hope and a future.
Amen.
What has God been dreaming of for you? God's plan for you? I don't know. I don't know God's plan for you, but I suspect it's going to involve some sickness. I suspect His plan for you is going to involve some struggling. I suspect it's going to involve some suffering too. But one thing I can tell you right from the mouth of God is that ultimately His plan is to prosper you. Ultimately, His plan is to give you hope and a future. In other words, and I love this so much, God says, I have a plan for you, and my plan is, at the end of the story, you win. Amen? At the end of the story, you have victory. Guys, that's the ultimate message of the whole Bible. Listen, you can read the whole Bible, and it's page after page of struggle. It's struggle, and it's more struggle, and it's more struggle, and more, and then you get to the end of the story, and there's one message, and that's victory! At the end of the story, we win! Amen? At the end of the story, we win. Now, our challenge is, we only see the beginning of the story. Right? We're living in the middle of the story. We don't see the end of the story, but God does. Yeah. God sees the end of the story. And God says, no matter what you have to go through in this life, here's the end of the story. I'm going to prosper you. Here's the end of the story. I'm going to give you hope and a future. At the end of the story, you win. I love the way the Apostle Paul said it to the Romans. He said, I consider that our present sufferings are not even worth comparing to the glory that's going to be revealed in us.
Amen.
Thank you.
Does Paul say you won't have suffering in this world? No, he said he acknowledges present suffering. You're going to suffer, he said. The Bible never says your suffering is going to stop in this world. But what it says is, whatever you have to suffer in this world is nothing compared to the blessings that God has in store. And that's the message God gave to Jeremiah. God told Jeremiah, you go buy that piece of land. Even when things around you look hopeless, go buy that piece of land. You go claim that promised future, because at the end of the story, you win.
Amen.
Whew. Got a little work out there. You know, I look around this room this morning and I see a lot of people who are going through a lot of trials right now. I think more of us are going through trials than not right now. For some of you, it's a health trial. For some of you, it might be a broken heart. Might be a failing marriage. Maybe your children are struggling. Maybe you're wrestling with an addiction. Maybe you don't know how you're going to pay your bills this month. We have a lot of people going through a lot of trials right here, right now. But please listen, every one of you. You've got something in this world that nothing can give you and nothing can take away. You have a story whose ending has already been written.
Amen.
I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord.
Victory in Jesus.
Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. At the end of the story, we win.
Victory in Jesus.
Amen. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, you have given us a great challenge living here in this world, God. You put struggles in our path. We all have to walk through the trials. We all have to walk through the valley. We all have to suffer. But God, you hold out this promise. You don't promise that our suffering will stop, but you promise that our suffering will count for something. And you promise that at the end of the story we win. For today, God, you ask us to have faith and to trust in your great promises. And so with all my heart, with all my blood and all my sweat and all my tears, I cry out to you, God, and I claim that promise for every soul here today. And I cry out to you, God, asking you to give every one of us the faith to stand on that promise and to trust in that promise, even in our darkest hour. No matter what we go through today, God, help us to remember that this is not the end of the story. And at the end of the story, we win. Thank you for that powerful reminder. It strengthens me. And I want to tell you that I love you, God. I love you for many reasons. I especially love you because you promised my victory. And I claim it in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Guys, we're going to wrap up service a little differently today. Pastor Brian has some announcements he needs to come in.